Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Perry, and this is,
Jayne Bartlett.
and we are going to walk you through Job Class 5. And originally it was called Blaming God. And we were realizing in our study that it might be a little bit more like not blaming God. So in the beginning of the book of Job, we know that Job went through severe trials. He lost his family, his servants, his livestock, and even his physical health. And he was still righteous through all of those trials, even though he had to suffer and face these challenges. So it's believed through this whole ordeal that it possibly took anywhere from 3 to 6 years. And that's a pretty long time of suffering. So during that time, as you read the book of Job, you can see where Job goes in and out of things. And we know that he has 3 friends that we heard from. And Job went from worshiping and mourning God righteously to actually accusing and blaming God. And that's what we're talking about today. So what is blame? Blame is to hold responsible for or to find fault. Blame is the actual act of criticizing or judging in a harsh manner. Blame is the opposite of praising God. We can see in Job 7 and 11 through 21, which is our main text. Therefore, I will not keep silent. I will speak out in anguish of spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. And this is Job just talking about how he's feeling. He says, I despise my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone. My days have no meaning. And he continues and he says, what is mankind? He starts to question God, that you make so much of them, that you give them so much attention, that you examine them every morning and test them in every moment. And right here in verse 20, the latter part, you can see is where Job begins to cross over from worshiping God and sharing his heart with God to starting to blame him. In the blue part, why have you made me your target? Have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my offenses or forgive my sins? So he doesn't like that what God is doing. He doesn't like this. And then further on in Job 21, 13 through 15, he's telling God that he doesn't like that the evil prosper and that sometimes the righteous suffer, and mainly him. He says they spend their years in prosperity and go down to the grave in peace. Yet they say to God, leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain by praying to him? So Job again is starting to question.
And I know that I can really relate to this. A few years ago, I experienced a series of losses. One of those losses hit me deeply. I lost a special someone suddenly. My heart was devastated. For a few months, I grieved in a righteous manner. I trusted that God's plan was right. I knew God loved me and would help heal my heart, and I would beg him, God, please heal my heart in your timing. But as the months continued, I started to grieve again the loss of my mother and grandmother, who died a few years before. Other situations added to my grieving. I was getting older and not married, so I was grieving the possible fact that I may never be married. And my biological clock was slowing and would stop soon. And the loss of becoming a mother was agonizing. I also continued to be in severe chronic pain continuously and was facing the loss of my career as an RN. On top of this, close friends would be frustrated with me for how long I was grieving and would tell me to move on and get over it. It really hurt. Like Job, when my friends did not get what I was going through, their lack of compassion was also devastating. I would express my anguish to God in loud cries and tears. As I went through this trial, I would also express to God my hurt, my anguish, my fears, disappointment, and how empty I was because of all that I had lost. This kind of sharing is okay. But then at about the 2-year mark, I started to be angry with God and all he was doing to me or allowing me to go through. I found myself being easily angered and having private fits of rages over the littlest of things. I would curse God and be so hurt and angry at my suffering that one day on the way to church, I pulled my car over and said, "Why am I going to church to worship a God that I hate?" The answer came immediately, "Because, stupid, it's the only way to get better." Then I proceeded to church.
Wow, Jayne, that is quite an experience. I am so sorry for all of your losses and your challenges. You lost family, you lost your physical health, and then also your career. And you were grieving, you were just grieving all those losses, and your friends didn't understand. So you were a lot like Job. And I totally respect and admire that you were crying out to God in faith and you were asking him what was going on. That is such a challenge. And I commend you for your faith and your struggle. And I grew up in a culture where it really wasn't our habit to blame God or to question God. But when things happened that we didn't understand, the response often was, God works in a mysterious way. And I remember when I was young, around 11 years old, I had a best friend named Crystal, and she died from sickle cell anemia. And I asked my mom, why did that happen? She was so nice. I loved her. And she said, sometimes we just don't understand God or understand his ways. And, sometimes we just don't understand why these things happen. And that is the premise of Job. Why do bad things happen to good people? So then that brings me to the question, well, what does God really want during these times when we're suffering and crying out to him? And, God really wants the true us. He knows us. He created us. He knows our inmost being, right? And he wants our hearts. And he wants to hear our fears and our questions and our doubts. And that's not wrong. And, we can even learn from many people in the Bible and some of our biblical heroes. I know Moses complained and cried out to God about the children of Israel. And in one incident in Numbers 11, 7-16, he cried out to God, and God had compassion on Moses and the children of Israel and gave some of his own spirit to Moses to give to the men so that they could lead the people and have their needs met, and that Moses would no longer have a burden. Jeremiah complained about how he felt and God was ineffective in helping him to save the people that he was sent to save. And then we know all about David in Psalm 64 and 142, and just really throughout the Psalms, he complained about his life being in danger and that he was in anguish because of his enemies. And, he had no one to help him. David says that often, I have no one to help me. From whom does my help come but the Lord? And even in his complaint, he recognized that God was his God and that he would return to God. So he was righteous in that. And in Job 19:7, Job says, though I cry, I've been wronged, I get no response. Though I call for help, there is no righteous. So Job was recognizing and or honoring God by responding in faith and reverence. He was still complaining to God.
And yet I know in Matthew 11:28-30, God tells us to come to him if we're weary and burdened, and he'll give us rest. That he wants us to take his yoke upon us and learn from him. And I know that really helps me in so many ways. Because when life really challenges us, This is where we can make the decision how we will handle things when we do not understand. It is important to be careful not to walk down the path of criticizing God, but to just really surrender our hearts to him. There's a good way and a bad way to go to God. The good is to express our hearts, our emotions, and good to appeal to God in a worshipful way. We do this for strength, to persevere, and to learn. It is not the best way to speak to God when we are hurting in an accusatory manner or attempt to build a case against him. If we start down this path and continue, this can lead us to shipwrecking our faith. Job did cross the line and was eventually rebuked by God. As disciples, we might want to ask ourselves, is this response to God going to bring me closer to God or pull me away from God? It's our decision which way we turn. So how do we handle things when we don't understand a situation or experience something we either don't like or that is life-changing? Let us look in Luke chapter 1, and it's talking about Zechariah and Mary as the angels come to them to tell them that they're going to have children. In verse 18, the angel came to Zechariah and said he would be a father. Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years." Yet in verse 34, Mary said, "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I am a virgin." Before the angel leaves her, Mary responds with one of the most challenging and humble responses I think one could have. "May it be to me as you have said." Then she treasured all these things the angel said in her heart. She believed what the angel said, all of it. She had wholehearted faith and trust in God in an unbelievably challenging situation. The outcome of these two questions is very different. Zechariah is unable to talk for the next 9 months, and Mary gets a detailed explanation. Why? The major difference is the intention of the question. What is behind it? Zechariah doubted the message and the ability of God to do this. He thought he knew more than God. Mary asked with a pure and simple heart. She asked to understand. She had not placed herself as an equal to God.
Wow, that is such a great example. Those two, Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth, and then Mary on her own, the mother of Jesus. Well, in John 11:20, verse 27, when Martha heard Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And Martha continues to speak to Jesus and asks the question, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Well, it makes that statement. And the way that Jesus responds is that he begins to explain who he is. "I'm the resurrection and the life. I'm the one who believes in me, even though he dies, will never die." And he says, "Do you believe this?" And then Martha says, "Yes, Lord." And so Jesus has a response to Martha that is sort of more like an intellectual and religious discussion. Whereas Mary, her response to the same question is different. It says, when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. And when Mary reached the place where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet. "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And then he says, "Where have you laid him?" That's the next question. And so, "Did you believe this?" like he asked his sister. And they said, "Come and see, Lord." And then Jesus wept. And this is the rest of the folks said, "See how he loved him." And so our response is important. And then there's also another response that there was a demon-possessed boy And his father didn't quite believe that Jesus could do it. And he said, well, if you can heal him. And Jesus' response was, if you can, everything is possible for he who believes. And it says, immediately the boy's father explained, I do believe. Help me overcome my belief. And those are some of the great responses that we can have as disciples when we're going through really hard troubles. You know, Mary's response, Jesus had compassion. And Martha, Jesus responded with information. And in Mary's response, Jesus raises him from the dead. And in Martha's response, again, he gives him information. But in the Father's response, he says, help me to overcome my belief, my unbelief. And many times in my life, I prayed, Lord, help me to overcome my unbelief because I know that the situation is more than I can handle. Other times in my life, I've prayed, God, please give me mercy. You know, we can ask God for those things. He wants us to know. He wants to know who we are. And sometimes I think we can ask God questions about our struggles. But sometimes I think it's important to ask from the heart, like, what is God trying to teach me here? Or what can I learn from this situation? Or maybe even, who can I help from this? So how we respond is really important.
To continue with my story, I was confessing to my best friend, April, and I confessed that I felt like I was doing the worse spiritually than I ever had done. I was surprised at her response. She said, I don't think so. You're more open than ever. I thought I had been an open person, but not to this level. This was the start of my path back to God. I knew getting back into the Bible, faith comes from hearing the word. I knew that that's where I needed to start. April would ask me to pray with her, and in the beginning, I would say she could. As time passed, I would only be able to get out the words, God, please heal my heart. But I also learned 3 things during this time. I learned how to be really open. I deepened my study on compassion, learning how God would want us to treat others in a difficult situation. And then I learned to put into practice what I had learned in having more compassion on others when they were in difficult situations. Now in Job chapter 23, verses 3 through 5, Job, he ends up demanding a right with God, a right that he does not have. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling, I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say. Job has now built a case with God and wants to argue with God. It is not our right, nor our right to question God to determine if he is right or wrong. And it's not always our right to get an answer that we approve of. As we see, Job never does get an answer from God as to why he suffered, and we may not either. And I know that's kind of hard living in America. We live in an entitled society. We think that we shouldn't have to suffer. We think we deserve the only good things, happiness, easy life. And yet that's not what God has promised us as disciples. He says in this world we'll have trouble.
Right. Jayne, thanks so much for sharing that. You know, in Job chapters 38 through 40, God is reminding us of who he is. And he always wants us to keep in mind about who he is and who Job is, you know, and God does respond to Job. And it says, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. And he said, brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? And I love how God asked Job questions that he cannot answer, because Job says, I want to argue with him. And so when you argue with God, I think God's going to win, So
Oh, yeah.
Job says, so God continues to ask Job other questions that I love. Like he says, were you there when I put my thumbprint in the sea? Or does the lightning report to you? Or, there's so many more. And, God finishes with, tell me if you understand, does the rain have a father? Who fathers the drops of dew? So, these are more rhetorical questions for Job because he can't answer them. And of course, God can. But God is also having mercy on Job. He could have destroyed Job, but he chose to sort of have this intellectual or spiritual conversation with Job and respond. And I think it's important as we learn that he speaks to Job out of the storm to let us know God's power. And then he also engages in a conversation to let us know his mercy.
I know during the time that I was going through my hardship and suffering, God was working in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I could not see clearly what the purpose of my trials were,
Right.
but I knew God would work all things for the good of those who love him.
Mm-hmm.
I started asking, what am I to learn from this? While still hoping it would end soon.
Right.
Now, it's been over 19 years since the loss of my loved ones, and 27 years of being disabled. I still live in chronic pain on a daily basis. Some of these trials will not go away after a few hours, days, months, years. Some may be permanent. The question is, will I still be faithful? Honestly, another question is, will our trials draw us closer to God or farther away from God? I praise God that I am still faithful. Looking back, I can honestly say that I would not have changed anything in my past. God knew that he needed that time to mold my character and refine me. The changes in my character are worth so much. I never would have changed these things in my character if it were not for my trials. In the end, Job became humble and was reconciled with God and became a better man as a result of his trials.
Mm-hmm.
In conclusion, God wants most of all our hearts. He wants to hear our struggles. He has big shoulders and will wipe away our tears, and in his timing, heal our hearts.
Jayne, thanks so much for saying that, because I just have utmost respect for you for going through the trials. But like you said, just choosing, who it is that we're going to honor. Is this trial going to bring you closer to God or not? So thank you so much for sharing that. I respect you and value so much of what you've shared. And just to be in chronic pain every day and have faith and give, that's just amazing to me. What a great example you are as a disciple. So we hope we've presented to you a better understanding of the difference between blaming God and questioning God. And the better one is to work out our hearts with God.
And always remember, it is our decision which way we turn. Thank you.
Thanks so much.